On October 14, 1947, Chuck Yeager climbed into a rocket plane with 2 broken ribs, got carried to 25,000 feet beneath a B-29 bomber, and then dropped. What follows is 14 minutes of flight that no human being had ever survived before, at least not at those speeds. He never told his commanding officers about the ribs. He never considered pulling out. Instead, he asked a friend to saw the end off a broom handle, fashioned a makeshift lever from the offcut, and used it to seal the cockpit door without engaging his right arm. The part of this story that tends to get buried under the heroics is what was happening inside his head during those 14 minutes. Or more accurately, what wasn't happening. Because at the moment Yeager broke the sound barrier, he wasn't running deliberate calculations. He wasn't consciously monitoring his inputs or narrating his own movements. He was operating on something that looked far less like analytical thought and far more like pure, trained instinct. And the neuroscience of why that distinction mattered, why it almost certainly had to be that way, turns out to be genuinely strange. Here is the part that surprises people. A single, conscious, analytical thought about what his body was doing in that cockpit could have ended the flight badly. Not as a figure of speech, as a real, mechanical consequence of how expert performance works under pressure. To understand why, you need to go back a little further. By the time Yeager climbed into the X-1, several pilots had already died attempting high-speed flight. British test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. perished in 1946 when his aircraft broke apart over the Thames estuary during a speed attempt. The closer any aircraft got to Mach 1, the more violently it shook, and engineers had started referring to the sound barrier as though it were a physical wall, something that might simply refuse to be crossed. Some genuinely believed no aircraft would survive the attempt. Colonel Albert Boyd had handpicked Yeager for the program, and not because of seniority or credentials. Boyd had observed something about the way Yeager operated when conditions deteriorated, a quality he described as instinct and the ability to remain focused under pressure. That observation would turn out to matter in ways that took decades to properly explain. The X-1 was a joint program between the US Air Force and NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the agency that would later become NASA. It carried no engine start capability of its own, so the B-29 hauled it to altitude and released it, at which point Yeager fired the rocket chambers in sequence. The aircraft registered Mach 1.06, roughly 700 miles per hour at that altitude, and then something unexpected happened. The violent buffeting that had characterized every previous high-speed approach simply stopped. The ride became quieter. The barrier everyone had feared turned out to be the smoothest part of the journey. Now, here is where the neuroscience comes in, and where the story shifts from aviation history into something with wider implications, the science of why this worked. Researcher Arne Dietrich, writing in the journal Consciousness and Cognition in 2004, proposed what he called the Transient Hypofrontality hypothesis. The brain, Dietrich argued, operates through 2 broad processing systems. One is explicit, verbal, analytical, deliberate, and anchored in the prefrontal cortex, what cognitive psychologists call declarative memory. The other is implicit, or procedural, automatic, pattern-based, and faster, supported largely by structures like the basal ganglia, which are closely tied to the dopaminergic system involved in motor learning and habit formation. When you first learn a skill, the explicit system carries most of the load. It checks, corrects, and narrates every step. As expertise develops over years of repetition, the skill migrates toward the implicit system, becoming fluent and automatic in a way the conscious mind no longer needs to supervise. Dietrich's argument was that what we call flow, a concept developed by psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who first described and named the state in the 1970s, may depend on the temporary quieting of that analytical, self-monitoring layer. The prefrontal cortex steps back, and the implicit system, carrying years of embedded skill, runs without interruption. It is worth being precise here, because this is an influential framework, not a settled one. Dietrich drew on converging indirect evidence from studies of meditation, endurance running, and dreaming, rather than from direct neuroimaging of flow itself. The technical challenge of scanning a brain during genuine peak performance is considerable, and the hypothesis remains widely cited but not yet fully confirmed. But here's the thing. The related research on what happens when the explicit system intrudes is far more direct. Psychologist R.S. Masters developed what is known as reinvestment theory, which documents the mechanism by which expert performers, specifically under pressure, sometimes revert to conscious monitoring of movements that had long since become automatic. When that happens, working memory, the brain's limited capacity system for holding and manipulating information in the moment, floods back into a process that no longer needs it. The outcome of that reversion has a name: paralysis by analysis. Researcher Sean Baylock, whose work on choking under pressure builds directly on Masters' reinvestment framework, has shown through controlled experiments that this intrusion of conscious attention is not just uncomfortable, it is mechanistically destructive to skilled performance. EEG research found that athletes who experienced performance breakdown under pressure showed greater interaction between left temporal and frontal brain regions compared to those who did not, suggesting that conscious attention was flooding back into a process that no longer needed it. The attention that feels like it should stabilize performance is, at that moment, precisely what destabilizes it. And what triggers that flood of conscious attention? Pressure. High stakes, the exact conditions that Yeager faced on October 14, 1947. Consider his situation through that frame. Yeager had accumulated 64 combat missions, 11.5 aerial victories, and years of test flying before he ever approached Mach 1. Nobody had flown Supersonic before, so no training had specifically prepared him for what would happen when the aircraft entered that range. What he brought into the cockpit wasn't a conscious model, it wasn't a verbal checklist, it was pattern recognition developed across thousands of hours of flight, encoded in the implicit system, procedural memory built below the threshold of deliberate thought, available without deliberation. When the aircraft started behaving in unfamiliar ways, that system responded faster than analytical thought could have. The broomstick handle deserves a moment, because it says something beyond courage. 2 days before the flight, Yeager fell from a horse, cracked 2 ribs on his right side, visited a civilian doctor in secret, and then worked with his friend, flight engineer Jack Ridley, to engineer a solution from a piece of sawn wood. He reported none of this to the program's authority figures. The mission was simply not open to deliberation, and there is something worth noting in that. When the analytical exit is removed, when the option of second guessing is taken off the table, the implicit system gets on with the work. The flight covered 14 minutes in total, with the supersonic portion lasting around 20 seconds. The US Air Force classified the achievement immediately, and the public did not learn about it until June 1948. Nearly 8 months after the fact. A world-changing event, locked away in a filing cabinet while the Cold War accelerated around it. What Yeager demonstrated, and what Dietrich, Csikszentmihalyi, Masters, and Baylock later gave the framework to describe, is that a certain level of performance sits beyond the reach of the conscious, analytical mind. Training can approach it. Preparation can create the conditions for it, but at the moment of execution, conscious supervision is not neutral. It carries a cost, and sometimes that cost is the performance itself. Most people will never face anything like those 14 minutes. The same mechanism, though, shows up in a presentation that falls apart the moment you start monitoring your own voice, in sport when a critical moment triggers a sudden, suffocating self-awareness. In any practice skill where thinking about the movement replaces actually making it. Yeager flew that morning with broken ribs, a borrowed wooden lever, and a brain doing something that took the science half a century to describe. The most rational thing he did on the morning he made history was to stop thinking. If the gap between what people assume about expert performance and what the research actually shows is the kind of territory that interests you, that's exactly what this channel covers.